I'll be surprised if this ends up with as my favorite book. Hi, I'm Josh and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be reading and reviewing the 5 candidates that have been chosen as the finalists for the Kaniehtiio Reads 2020 competition. Okay, so it is March 3rd or 4th, it's Tuesday, the first week of March, and basically I am doing my own little reading challenge where I'm reading all 5 books that have been chosen for the Kaniehtiio Reads 2020 competition. Essentially, my goal is here to read through all the books and then provide you a review of each, my thoughts of them, as we approach the inevitable debates and final decision for the Kaniehtiio Reads 2020. If you haven't heard of Kaniehtiio Reads 2020, this is essentially a competition where you have a number of books that are being proposed as books that every Canadian should read. And in the end, you have one book obviously being chosen, but before that, you have a series of debates being held where someone will represent a book and will defend it to the audience, when the audience will vote for it. Honestly, this is my first year ever hearing about it, so I don't know exactly how they're going to choose or who's voting or how the voting is counted. I'm not really that concerned. I just thought it'd be really cool to read them and review them. So I entered this challenge with the goal of reading all of the candidates for Kaniehtiio Reads 2020 with the understanding that the purpose of Kaniehtiio Reads is to pick the book that every Canadian should read. Now that I've finished and done a bit more reading, I realize now that there's apparently a specific theme every year. And this year's theme is a book to bring Canadians into focus, or to help Canadians focus. That, I feel like, should have been considered when I was talking about whether or not these books are the best candidate. Now, overall, I feel like the things I had to say are still relevant, but it does make me want to reconsider my final thoughts. So just keep in mind that when I talk about these books, I'm going to be talking about it from the perspective of which book should all Canadians read. And then at the very end, I'll tack on some additional thoughts with the specific theme that is being used for this year's Kaniehtiio Reads. If you don't know much about me, I am an American, but I live in London, Ontario, where I go to grad school. I've been here for, I think, 4 years now, and I figured, why don't I do this? I mean, I've been here long enough to want to do Canadian things, and also because there were actually several really interesting authors. There are several Indigenous authors here, but also the books that have been chosen seem really interesting, so I'm really excited to be reading them. The 5 books that have been chosen are as follows. The first one's going to be Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club by Gail Coles. This is a fiction book. That's about the best I can do. The synopsis says, February in Newfoundland is the longest month of the year. Another blizzard is threatening to tear strip downtown St. John's, while inside the Hazel restaurant, a storm system of sex, betrayal, addiction, and hurt is breaking overhead. By turns biting, funny, poetic, heartbreaking, Gail Coles' debut novel rips into the inner lives of a wicked cast of characters, building toward a climax that will shred perceptions and force a reckoning. This is a blistering Newfoundland Gothic from the 21st century, a wholly original, bracing, and timely portrait of a place in the throes of enormous change, while 2 women confront the traumas of their past and attempt to overcome their present and hopefully pick up a future. The next book is Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson, and this is the first of actual series. This is a fantasy novel. Here's a brief review. A compelling coming-of-age novel in which everyday teen existence crashes up against indigenous beliefs, crazy family dynamics, and cannibalistic river otters. Robinson has a gift for making disparate elements coming together into a convincing narrative, breathing myth, lore, and magic into otherwise harsh realities. It should be mentioned that Eden Robinson is Indigenous, and that's being tied into the plot here, and I think it'll be really interesting because I love magic and I love exploring new magic systems, especially those that are based in existing mythologies. The next one is Radicalized by Cory, Doctorow. I don't have a copy of this one. I'm going to be listening to it by audio. This is a series of short stories, I believe, all centered around the apocalypse, or it's a novel centered around the apocalypse. I'm not sure. Here are 4 urgent stories from author and activist Cory Doctorow. 4 social, technological, and economic visions of the world. Now, the last 2 are memoirs. The first one being From the Ashes by Thistle. And this is another indigenous author who is basically talking about his experience growing up as part indigenous and trying to survive in a world of bigotry and racism. And also a world that is just sort of set up against him. The next one is We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir. This one I'm really excited for because, well, 1, queer, and 2, I haven't read a lot of Muslim narratives, so I'm intrigued to see what she has to offer about the story of her life. The synopsis says, Samra Habib has spent most of her life searching for the safety to be herself. As an Ahmadi Muslim growing up in Pakistan, she faced regular threats from Islamic extremists who believe the small dynamic sect to be blasphemous. And so those are the 5 books I'll be reading, hopefully this week. Most of them are actually pretty short. The longest, I believe, is Small Game Hunting, and unfortunately it's also the only one I do not have on audio. I bought it because I needed a physical copy, and instead of a Trickster, I found on Book Outlet, which was nice. At this moment in time, it's Tuesday, March 3rd. I've already started Small Game Hunting, and I've also started From the Ashes. I'm probably halfway through From the Ashes, probably a bit more. I'm hoping to finish it tonight. If I don't, I'm sure I'll finish it tomorrow. And then the last 3 that I'm doing by audio should go by quicker, I think, because they're shorter. My biggest worry here is that I'm hoping to get this done in a week's time and sort of treating it like a personal readathon. And that means finishing Small Game Hunting, which is nearly 450 pages in 1 week. And so far I'm finding it very difficult. I am having trouble with Small Game Hunting. The writing is quite the experience. I can't tell if I love it or if I hate it. I won't lie, I have become visibly angry at this book at times as I think about how stressed I am about my ability to actually get through it. First off, let's talk about just basic grammar. She takes some writing liberties as to how she actually writes the story. She doesn't use parentheses when someone's talking. Apparently when I googled it, it's been done before, but I've never seen it before, and it makes it really hard. And it's not just that, it's also just the type of writing. The writing is almost like stream of consciousness, where the way it all connects is really hard to decipher. And the fact is, this is 450 pages. I'm a very slow reader. I am not going to be rereading every single page. So I may end up reading it and not ascertaining anything. I'm not sure yet. That said, what little I have been able to ascertain from the 24 pages or so that I have read, have actually been really intriguing, and they seem to be alluding to some serious conflict coming our way, and I'm definitely intrigued enough to want to keep going. I really hope I get through this. I don't know. Ideally, I could have gotten this on ebook, and then I could have had the e-reader read it to me while I read it to get through it faster. That wouldn't have made it make more sense, but it would have helped me with my slow reading pace. Unfortunately, it's not out in America, and my Kindle is registered in America. So my first impressions of From the Ashes, I will say I had a little trouble getting into it at first. Part of it's because it's being narrated by the author. It's kind of a bland narration, which is hard to get into. That said, I was able to get into it, and it is a really intriguing story of his life. And we're following him as his parents basically end up leaving him with his parents, with his grandparents, and him having to try and survive with his grandparents, who are very strict and have a very particular way of trying to parent. And that, of course, will have some adverse effects on some of the decisions that they make. These decisions will lead to other poor decisions, which can lead to long-term life choices, which can be very damaging. Now, he's writing this memoir, which suggests that there's going to be a turning point somewhere, but it's clearly leading down a very sad path. And he actually starts the novel with the point that he ends up in prison. And I believe this whole story is about how does he end up there. So it's intriguing. I don't think I've ever read a memoir by an indigenous person talking about their experience. But for now, it is a very sad story. As far as the quality of the book, honestly, it's fine. I mean, I can't tell if it's going to be a 4 or 3.5 star. Probably won't be a 3, but also probably won't be a 5. I haven't found his writing to be particularly immersive or poetic. So again, this might be a personal preference, but right now I'll be surprised if this ends up with as my favorite book from this set of 5. I mean, the purpose of Canada Reads is to say which book should every Canadian read. And it isn't always about the enjoyment of the book or the writing itself of the book. Sometimes it's the content that will matter, and this view at his Indigenous lifestyle or his history as an Indigenous person is really where I think this book will shine. Of course, I'm curious to see how Son of a Trickster turns out as a book that basically details Indigenous mythology and how much that'll tie into Indigenous lifestyle. So it is Thursday, about 7 p.m., 7:15, and I don't think I gave an update yesterday, at least not yesterday evening. But I wanted to. I just came home and passed out. I finished From the Ashes by Thistle. I really enjoyed it, gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good book. As I said, I enjoyed it. If I had to have any faults in it, it would be the writing style, which even that, I'd probably still give that a 4 out of 5 stars. It's just more when I think about the fact that it was just okay writing, I thought. I guess I didn't enjoy the writing as much as I would have liked. It was just a personal preference. At the beginning, it's a little confusing, where it seems like certain things are happening and they don't happen, and I don't always quite understand why. It's as if like, okay, this is about to happen, but it didn't happen, and there was some confusion there. But overall, it was an easy to understand book. It was a very good book. I mean, the story is about him basically being raised in a broken family and also having to deal with racism as an Indigenous person, and then basically falling into a life of abuse, of drug abuse and crime, and nearly coming to the brink of death before he finally makes his way out. There were a lot of times that religion gets brought up in this book. He never expressly turns to religion as the saving grace of his whole process, which I liked. I'm sure there are plenty of people, most people probably, who are Christian who might appreciate that kind of story, but personally, when I'm looking for a story of strength, I want something beyond religion, because even if you do believe in religion, it still takes internal strength, and I want to be able to hear that story. And I feel like he told that story, which is really moving. I absolutely understand why it's on this list. As an Indigenous person, as well as someone who basically lived as a homeless person, one of the biggest things I've noticed while living in London, Ontario, is a serious problem with homeless people. And it's almost as if it just isn't addressed. Granted, I haven't looked much into it, but I know that there were a lot of them, and this book does a great job of humanizing them and helping us appreciate the fact that each of them have their own unique plight. And in that sense, I think it'll be very useful for a Canadian to read. When I approached this video, my goal was to basically to read all the books and choose which one I feel like should be the winner. Originally, I thought whichever one gets the highest rating must be it. But now I'm realizing very quickly that is not the case. Just because I don't enjoy a book as much doesn't mean the content in it isn't worth reading. And to be clear, From the Ashes was a great book. It was easy to read and very moving. It was a very good story. However, when I think about me trying to choose which one of these books should be the book that gets chosen, I feel problematic doing that. I am a white male who is queer, and that is one of the pieces of the books that are in this list. But as a white male, I'm still a very privileged person, even as a queer person. And so I'm hesitant to try and sell to you which one is the authoritative best option. That said, I will choose which one I feel like might be most useful. At the same time, I'm quickly realizing they all have a very important narrative that needs to be heard. And with that, I can go ahead and mention that I moved on to We've Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir by Samra Habib, and I'm really enjoying this. The narrator is a much better. Part of that's because it's a professional narrator. I'm enjoying the story. I will say that I don't know. It just seems impossible to compare these two different life stories. They're both very moving, and I'm enjoying them both. I think they're both very different perspectives, and so it's not a question of which perspective is more valid or which perspective it needs to be heard. So far, I would say I resonated more with Thistle's story than with Samra Habib, which is understandable. She is a Muslim queer woman, and naturally, that is something that may be harder for me to connect with. However, that might be a reason for why it's so important to be read. I may be halfway through it. I don't know what I'm going to think in the end, but we're still very much in the initial stages of trying to figure out, or rather, of understanding the life that she's in, the very conservative life of basically being told what to do, being subjugated by men. And I'm looking forward to the narrative to where she, I'm assuming, breaks free, becomes more independent. Not to suggest that you can't be queer and still be Muslim. I don't know how much she's going to break free. We're going to find out. And then I've also made a bit of progress in Small Game Hunting by Megan Gail Coles. And this one has taken me a lot of time. I may end up reading this into the next week during Backlist Readathon. It is slow going, but I'm hoping that I'm finally getting into it. It is something that has made me visibly angry. I think I said that last time I recorded this, but I found an approach that really works for me in the sense that I'm not stressing too much about each sentence. So I have a habit of reading every word and making sure I fully articulate every single word and exactly what is meant every single time. And that's part of the reason I read so slow. But I'm trying to practice something new, almost to the art of skimming, but I wouldn't say it's quite that, but rather it's reading over a sentence really quickly, taking whatever meaning I can from it. Sometimes that meaning might be wrong, and sometimes I might leave it realizing I didn't get anything from that sentence, and just hopefully something else will make up for it later on. Because this book is very hard to read, and I'm not going to obsess over every line. I don't have time for that. And I'm hoping that there's still plenty to be taken from this with that type of approach. And honestly, I think there is. I still feel like I'm able to follow along and get each moment what's going on. What's more, this feels like it's being told in sort of like a conversational narrative where each character is sort of telling us their thoughts, or we're getting an insight into their thoughts, which I guess might make sense why it isn't always grammatically consistent. Nevertheless, as much as I am loving where I think this book is going, I am not sure if it's the best candidate for Canada Reads, because part of this is about being able to expose yourself to new experiences, to new ways of thinking and viewing the world. However, this book does it in such a way that I think may not be very accessible for a lot of people. It may work great as a work of literature and even in the classroom, but as something everyday Canadians should read, I don't know. I feel like if this is going where I think it's going, which is a discussion of sexism and misogyny in society. It may be much more than that, I'm not sure, but this is the first hints that I'm getting. I feel like there are other stories that will highlight this problem and these problems in a way that is easier to consume. Of course, if you've read this and you think I'm mischaracterizing, let me know in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing more about this. I may end up seeking out some reading discussions after I do read this, because it's an interesting. She's making some really interesting choices in how she chooses to write this. But as much as it enrages me at times, I can't escape the desire to keep going, because I leave every moment, every session of reading, wanting to read more. It's exhausting trying to get into it. But once I'm in it, I don't want to stop. Today is Thursday. I feel confident I'll finish We Have Always Been Here today. It's a very short audiobook. And then I'll have just 2 more audiobooks to read. One will be The Son of the Trickster by Eden Robinson. And the other one will be that other book, which is a short story collection. I don't remember. I haven't decided which one I want to read first. Son of a Trickster, I don't know. I know it is a fictional book, and I am worried that it's going to be a very intricate book. So I don't want to rush through it. It's something I really want to enjoy, especially since I've already bought the sequel in this series. And so I'm interested to see what it presents and what we can get from it. And I'm just really excited for it. I also want to read a lot more of this tonight. I'm on page like 60, maybe 65 of 450. I need to read 4 hours a day right now to finish this by Monday. So we'll see how tonight goes with this. I have a cough. God, I'm getting paranoid. Good morning or afternoon. It's Saturday at about 2 p.m. Jesus, I really wasted my day today. I finished We Have Always Been Here, and I loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think part of the reason I was able to resonate so much was this story of coming out narrative. I can really relate. I felt like she did a really good job articulating the troubles of trying to understand and accept oneself when a part of a system of a religion that tells you everything about you on a fundamental level is wrong. And I thought she did a fantastic job articulating what it's like to try and overcome that. She didn't leave her religion. Instead, she found a way to make her religion work for her. Obviously, that's not what I did. Or rather, it's not what I did, if you don't know that. But I still thought it was a beautiful story. And I also loved how she was able to touch on the role her parents played in the harm of basically pushing the religion on her, while at the same time them growing and caring enough to show support with her with time. Basically, she was able to recognize the harm while still making them appear in a way that is loving and caring, which I can relate to. Like, my parents have made decisions which I feel like are objectively harmful, but that doesn't mean they don't accept me for who I am now. And for that, I absolutely loved it. As far as if I think it makes for a good candidate, obviously it deserves to be on this list, without a doubt. Whether or not it beats the last one I finished, From the Ashes, I'm not entirely sure. I am coming from a biased perception because I live in Ontario, and I've only ever lived in London, Ontario. And I think that homelessness is a real problem that needs to be focused on. And on top of that, the book still touches on racism and xenophobia in a way. And so if I had to choose between the two right now, I'd probably say From the Ashes, but I'm still reading. I am almost done with Cory Wortlow, or whatever his name was, his book, Radicalized, and I'm really enjoying it. I do not think it's a good fit for Canada Reads. First off, Canada Reads is supposed to be about the one book that everyone should read, and that suggests the book should be able to highlight, bring attention to, or persuade. And I don't see this book persuading anyone. It is very, very leftist in a way that I understand and can relate to. It's like it really calls out some serious issues, but it's presented in such a way that I feel like it could be easily dismissed by anyone who disagrees with him in the slightest. It basically seems like an homage to Bernie Sanders, which isn't Canadian at all. So it is a good book. Not very Canadian, but also I don't think good for the masses. It basically is a book that speaks to the choir, and we need something that can strike the core of someone, regardless of their preconceived notions, or something that can break through those preconceived notions, and I don't think that this book is it. Now, I'm almost done with it, and then I'll finish it. I'm still only about 18% through small game hunting, and I haven't started the last book, Son of a Trickster, yet, which I'm going to hopefully start today. Now, after a great deal of trouble, I was able to buy Small Game Hunting ebook on Amazon.ca, and I was able to find a way to get the ebook on my American Kindle. Don't ask questions. But in any case, it's going to help me get through it. It probably still won't be till Monday or next week before I finish, which is okay. I think I can make time for that while still getting through my 3 or 4 backlist reads. But it will drastically improve my ability to get through it faster, because I wasn't feeling motivated, especially today, to pick up the book and read it. That may just speak to the quality of the book. I enjoy it when I read it on the bus, but it also, maybe half the time I enjoy it, half the time I hate it because it doesn't make any sense, or it's just so difficult to follow. Okay, I finished The Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I think it's definitely worth considering for Canada Reads 2020. I feel like all the other ones or that I've read so far are very obvious as to why they should be in this, while that one is more subtle. It does a number of things. One, it covers Indigenous lifestyle, that is to say what it's like to be an Indigenous person, with a little bit of racism, and we also see themes of drug addiction and having parents who are distant or disconnected. While I don't mean to suggest that it's necessarily systematic of Indigenous people, it's just a comparison between From the Ashes to this book. I liked having the Indigenous mythology as a part of the narrative. I feel like this book is worth considering because it isn't just a political narrative. It isn't just a selling point as to this is why you should care. It's an educational book to help familiarize you with
indigenous heritage, or at least the particular mythology that is covered in that book. And I think that's something worth considering. This is a book that could easily be read and enjoyed casually by a lot of people, and also be educational. And for that reason, I think it's worth considering. Not all books have to be life-changing emotional impacts, and I think this might be considered a good book worth reading. I am not ready to make a decision yet, but right now I'm thinking between We've Always Been Here and Son of a Trickster. I'm halfway through this. I have a few hours left according to my Kindle, so that's positive. Hopefully I'll finish today, if not then tomorrow. Okay, it's Monday, March 9th at 11:23, and I finished small game hunting at the local Coward Gun Club, and I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I came very close to giving it 3.5 out of 5, but I ultimately decided that it is something that I solidly enjoyed, even if I had my problems with it along the way. It's a solid story, a solid book, and arguably might be my favorite book that I read, despite being closest to my lowest rated book of the week, just because it was probably the most thought-provoking, even if it was the most difficult to read. And ultimately I found the ebook and the ability to listen to the ebook to be very helpful in getting through this. But I really enjoyed the story and the takeaway. A lot of discussion here in terms of toxic masculinity, the patriarchy, gaslighting, and just emotional manipulation, and generally mistreating women. A lot of rape culture in here, a lot of power dynamics, and it is a very difficult book to read. There are so many women in here that are getting abused in so many ways. It was a very dark novel for that reason. And if I had to think to myself, what book covers the most important topic, that is a very difficult question to answer. And I want to be very clear that I'm not sure if I'm the right person to make that distinction. This book is focused more on gender and gender discriminations. That said, it does touch on race and also queerness or LGBTQIA+. So that is included in here. Of course, the primary narrative is one of gender. As far as what I think is one of the biggest problems that need to be addressed, personally, I think the issues around gender are a really big one. Now, I don't mean to minimize the rest of them, it's just, personally, I think, from my experience, that society needs to hear what's being told in this story. It's something that really needs to be across to people. The harm of rape culture, the harm of when you treat women this way, or men this way, and you're emotionally abusing them, how it's not okay, the things that people think are okay are not okay. And this really highlights a lot of the emotional damage that it does, and I really enjoyed it as much as one can enjoy that. Anyways, I enjoyed it for that reason. However, ultimately, if I were voting on which one should win, I wouldn't vote for this one, despite probably being the most important in the topic discussed. Ultimately, because it's a question of what book should every Canadian read, and I'm not convinced this will do the job that it's trying to do for everyone. It is a tough book to read, and I don't see everyone pushing through it. And ultimately, reading something might end up meaning giving up on it once you start it. And if they do that, then it's sort of a lost cause. So in that sense, I have to ask myself, how important is the ease of reading a book? How easy should a book be to read? And ultimately, I think that has to be something we consider, and I don't think this book qualifies for that. I think too many people will begin it and then stop it because of the dialect and just the way the narrative is told in a way that is kind of confusing to get into. Ultimately, I got into it, I was able to follow along easily enough. It basically is being told from this perspective of, it's like every chapter is essentially a new perspective from a new character. Think of it sort of like Game of Thrones, how each chapter is from their point of view, except this is still third person. We're basically getting a third person description of what's going on with a focus on one character each chapter. Now towards the middle to the end of the book, we start to diverge from character-centric chapters as our characters start to merge. But it's a slow reveal as to what exactly is going on. She focuses heavily early on not necessarily what has been going on, but rather the emotional and physical ramifications of their actions. So basically, we're giving the emotional and physical status of all of our characters from the get-go without any context as to how they got there. And it is a really interesting way of telling the story, but it's also very confusing. Nevertheless, I enjoyed it. Highly recommend it. I think it's worth giving a try. But if I had one book to get all Canadians to read, would it be this one? No, unfortunately. So let's think about this. I want to start with a book that I just don't think deserves as well, which is going to be Radicalized by Cory Doctorow. It is another book that I absolutely loved. I ended up giving 4 out of 5 stars, but all of the short stories I thought were fantastic. They were really well told. They were just great science fiction and very poignant political statements. But, as I said before, it's preaching to the choir. It's not going to change any minds. And as much as I love the stories and how they were told, I don't see it making a difference in the landscape of this type of discussions that are going on. On top of that, I thought it was kind of blind when it came to gender. It did touch on race. There was one novella which I thought was fantastic as far as how we address racism and police brutality. But overall, I felt like it wasn't the most encompassing of books. So sadly, I can't pick that one either. So now we're down to From the Ashes, Son of a Trickster, and We Have Always Been Here. So now let's think about We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib. This is the only book I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Now, the reason I did that, I think, is because you had this narrative of this religious person, of this young girl who is religious, and the religion tells them that their sexuality is wrong, their identity is wrong, and they slowly come to accept who they are, and they come to peace with that, and they learn to live a life that allows them to be who they are, just who they were born to be. And it was a story of how they were trying to come out to their family, to their friends, how they cope, and ultimately how their family came to accept them. And to me, I was just able to relate to that so much that it really struck a chord in a way that I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it, and I couldn't not give it 5 out of 5 stars. It was well told, and it really resonated with me. I don't know if necessarily it's the story that needs to be told to everyone. I don't mean to suggest that religion and race and sexuality isn't a topic that doesn't need to be addressed or doesn't need to be focused on. I guess it's a question of, does this book do it better than the other ones? And ultimately, I think not. It does a great job focusing on sexuality and on discrimination in Pakistan and in this community, and how Islam isn't inherently sexist, or at least from her perspective, and how she can learn to be a part of her religion and still be herself. So that is one thing to have there. Now, I'm an atheist, and I'm very much against religion, so that might be biasing my opinion here, but I just don't think that that aspect of the story is as important for people to hear. I do think sexuality is still a topic that needs to be addressed, but at the same time, I feel like we've made so much progress when it comes to LGBTQIA plus acceptance that I feel like there are more important topics to bring attention to. I want to resonate again that I recognize that as a cisgendered white male, I do not think that I am qualified to make the decision on what everyone should read. This is just my own personal judgment on what I would like people to expose themselves to. Just to be clear, all these books are fantastic. They're all worth reading. I think they all offer something for you to take away. It's just a question of which one I would put on a pedestal above all the rest. It's a personal preference, and of course also based off of my limited experience. But with that said, not we have always been here. So now, From the Ashes and Son of a Trickster. How did we get here? I honestly wasn't expecting to get here. I'm torn because From the Ashes is a very emotional and necessary read that brings attention to, one, the indigenous population, but also to the impoverished and the homeless in Canada, which is a big problem in North America in general. And for that reason, I think it probably is very much worth reading. It might be the most important one. If I compare it to Radicalized, which also touches on capitalism and the wealthy getting more than their share, Radicalized sort of touches on that same topic. It doesn't touch on sexuality as much, and I don't recall it addressing gender as much, which I feel like is a limitation. I do feel like we need some adjustment of gender. So I hate that I sort of restricted myself now to 2 books that don't really cover that very much. Son of a Trickster, on the other hand, still touches on this one narrative of an indigenous lifestyle, while also exposing Canadians to one form of indigenous mythology. And I think there's something to be said about just familiarizing Canadians with the mythology of their homeland, of the people who came before them, who were here before them. And I think that's something that's worth reading. I think that it may not cause a massive political movement. I think that's something that's definitely worth valuing, which is one reason why I sort of left it here in this decision of which one deserves to be read. And I am torn because I also love the writing more by Eden Robinson than Jesse Thistle. I didn't much care for the writing in From the Ashes. From the Ashes is really a matter of the content and what it says about the struggle that some people have to go through. Ultimately, I don't know what the answer should be. I've gotten myself to this position where I think it's between these two. And I'm torn. I think there's something to be said about treating this as a way to bring attention to serious issues. In that sense, it should be From the Ashes. In the other sense, if I could think of a book that every Canadian could read in school, I think Son of a Trickster is a great book. It is basically just a great way to familiarize yourself with indigenous mythology, while also introducing you to some of the same themes regarding family for an indigenous person. Now, I don't know how representative Son of a Trickster is, or From the Ashes. However, they both seem to suggest that drugs are an issue, as well, and when that becomes an issue, of course, you have trouble with a stable home. I'm sure that this isn't to say every indigenous person suffers from this, but I imagine it's meant to represent a prevailing problem. So in that sense, I imagine Son of a Trickster does bring attention to that. Ultimately, it is a question of what we expect to get from Canada Reads 2020. I'm not familiar with Canada Reads. I've never participated in it before. Perhaps I should have done a little research to see what type of books it is that they try to push, that they try to promote. Is it more a general type of story, or is it a political statement that we're trying to bring attention to? They're both, I feel like, very valid. And for this, I just want to say that I kind of want to leave them both as it. That said, I'm going to come to my own personal conclusion, and I'm going to ignore the political side of it. And I'm going to say that Son of a Trickster deserves to win because it is a good book, and it's just a fascinating plot, fascinating topic, and it's a book that I feel like a lot of people could coalesce around. Because it's a fictional narrative, I feel like people might be less afraid to dig into it. Nonfiction can be kind of scary, as can be this sort of very emotionally wrought story that we see in From the Ashes. Obviously, they're all worth reading. I don't mean to suggest that it's not. But if I had to say, hey, all Canadians, you should read this, I think I would go with Son of a Trickster. I think it says something about the literary merit of Son of a Trickster and its significance in Canadian culture, and I think it does deserve that. Don't get me wrong, I feel like so does Small Game Hunting. I just don't see the people picking this up. So this is kind of like an argument of electability. I don't see this being electable.
As I said at the start of this video, I did not realize going in there was a specific theme for each year. And since this year's theme is a book to help Canadians focus, or to bring Canadians into focus, I wonder if I should reconsider my final thoughts here. So we have still, I think, these two last candidates. We're between some of it Trickster and From the Ashes. Both of them, I feel like, still do what we're looking to be done for Canada Reads. One thing I didn't mention about Son of a Trickster before was that it touches on LGBTQ issues. It also touches on gender and how gender is looked at. That's one thing that From the Ashes does not do. That said, it's not a major part of the book. Ultimately, though, when we ask this question of which book will best bring into focus things that Canadians need to think about, I can't help but move towards From the Ashes. I am coming to this conclusion as I talk. I'm not really good at preparing ahead of time, but when I think about it, Son of a Trickster helps familiarize Canadians with Indigenous mythology and with some of the issues around that, but I'm not sure if it necessarily brings attention to the overarching problems for Indigenous people and for other people outside of the Indigenous population in the same way that From the Ashes does. So in the context of which book will best bring Canadians into focus, I can't help but think it's probably going to be From the Ashes. Personally, if I had to choose the book I would be a Canadian to read out of the four, I think Son of a Trickster is worth reading. I mean, they all are, obviously. But given the theme that we have, I think the likely winner, or the book that should win, is going to be From the Ashes by Jesse Thistle. I want to be very clear. Again, let me reiterate. I don't mean to pretend like this is the right way. This is just me trying to interpret a situation, think about what it is that I would push. And I am not even a Canadian. So let me be very clear in the sense that all I'm trying to do here is articulate what each book is giving and then give my conclusion, just because I feel like it defeats the purpose of the video if I don't give my thoughts on which one I think should win for what reason. You can disagree, and hopefully I've given you the material you need to make those sort of deciding points. Hopefully you can read all these books, and if you can't, I hope that I've given you enough details on each of them to help you pick which one you want to pick up, if you can only pick up one. Overall, I would say this has been a very successful challenge. The hardest read for me, again, was Small Game Hunting. And even that, I'm really glad that I read. All of these books were just such a great experience. I gave them all 4 to 5 stars, and I loved them. And I also feel like I'm more familiarized with Canadian culture. I definitely want to look back and see what the other winners were. Maybe I can do more videos on reading Canada Reads 2020 winners. And maybe reassess my thoughts on these. I don't know. And might just do a response video when the actual debates come up, because now that I've read all the books, I can watch them and give a response. I don't know when people will watch this. I had never heard of Canada Reads on YouTube before. That said, I think it's something worth bringing attention to. I was not looking at the lists. And this is something worth watching. This is something worth reading. All of them are. And especially if you're Canadian, I highly encourage you to look into this further. If you like literary fiction, I definitely recommend this. If you like nonfiction and you're looking to familiarize yourself with some of the serious issues plaguing Canadians, Jesse Thistle's From the Ashes and Samra Habib, We've Always Been Here, both great picks. And if you're looking to just have a fun, casual read that is also educational and help you better familiarize yourself, connect to Indigenous mythology, Son of a Trickster is a great book to check out. It's a series, and it's something I plan on continuing reading. I really hope you enjoyed my video. I'm curious to hear if any of you have read the books, or if you plan on reading any in the comments, so please let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day. I'll see you next time.